are these people?
We can get to reading the article that Whitney published about Les Wexner and Ohio, because it's fascinating. I went through it, and I want to go through it here, because I think a lot of people skim it, or they don't necessarily read through it, and we're going to read through it. Yes, Angel Israel is doing the Greater Israel Project, and nobody seems to be stopping them, and that's the problem. All right, Technate, Ohio. How Leslie Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein built the Silicon Heartland. Okay, so this is the blueprint that lays out where all these different companies are in relation to, I believe one of these is his compound. Okay, but where all these different tech companies are located now, at least have an office. Ohio has become the new destination for big tech data centers and AI infrastructure. The state owes much of its rapid transformation to the so-called Silicon Heartland, to the now vast array of public-private partnerships pioneered by the state's richest man, Leslie Wexner, and his former money manager and fixer, we know his name, Jeffrey Epstein. And this is by Whitney and by Mark Goodwin. Also, don't want to forget to mention Mark. They co-wrote this together. So I'm gonna start. Let's blow this up a little bit so everybody can read it with me. That early last year, shortly after Trump took office for his second term, former presidential candidate, we know this guy, Vivek Ramaswamy, announced that he was departing the recently formed Department of Government Efficiency. Remember, he was number 2 at DOGE underneath Elon. All right, after reports of conflict with the department's co-head, Elon Musk. Vivek joined Fox News to clarify these rumors and to tease his next endeavor, holding public office. And he ran for governor, I believe. Vivek noted Musk's approach was a technology approach, whereas his was focused more on constitutional law, legislative-based approach. Okay, whatever that meant. But he further explained that when you're talking about constitutional revival, it's not just done through the federal government, it's done through federalism, where states also lead the way. Okay. Despite their differences, Ramaswamy importantly remarked that they were both on the same page, sure they are, and that their attempts in saving the country required them to divide and conquer. Okay, so that's his excuse to say, look, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go do the state thing because there's plenty of room out there for all of us to do our thing, and he'll make plenty of money. And remember, he's already made millions doing basically nothing. Okay? Himbo, you lie. All right? You do not live in Ohio, sir. All right? Descent in Blue does live in Ohio. That's funny. All right. Toward the end of the interview, Vivek mentioned that he was flying back to Ohio that week with an announcement regarding his expressed intention of pushing for reform at the state level, coming shortly. The former presidential hopeful explained that when we look at the country over the last 20 years, he's such a slimeball. He tries to be Caramel Obama in so many ways, but for the right. All right. Over the last 20 years, Silicon Valley was at the bleeding edge of the American economy. I think the Ohio River Valley can be at the bleeding edge of the American economy for the next 20 years. A few weeks later, Vivek's gubernatorial campaign for Ohio was announced, and the former DOGE co-head was promptly endorsed by Trump. Over the course of that campaign, Vivek's fortunes have quite literally soared. What a shock. Since launching, he's not only come to command a massive campaign war chest filled by deep-pocketed donors, but his own net worth has doubled. And again, anywhere you see an underline here, there's a receipt to some link somewhere. Now, in this case, his doubled net worth goes to a Forbes article that talks about that. All right, the campaign war chest is from notus.org. The thing from a few weeks later is from the BBC. So a lot of this stuff is sourced. While many once labeled this campaign as a clear demotion for Vivek, the reality of an emerging Ohio, specifically as it relates to the technocratic goals of the Trump admin and its donors, most importantly, paints a very different picture. As noted in Ian Davis's book, The Technocratic Dark State, which, by the way, is published, I believe, by Whitney and Mark's publishing company, Doge, which is the agency that Ramaswamy co-led, is part of a larger effort led largely by a small group of the ultra-wealthy to completely privatize the public sector in the name of greater efficiency and have it ruled by techno kings or dictator CEOs. This is like, what's the thing in Ecuador, the Prospera that they're trying to build. All right, I'm sure she'll get to Prospera at some point. Ian Davis frames this as a modern iteration of technocracy, bolstered by tech billionaires with close ties to the Trump admin, such as Musk and the evil snake reptile Peter Thiel. The reptile, by the way, is an anagram for his name, Peter Thiel. Not saying, just saying. Thiel is the longtime benefactor of Ohio Congressman and current Vice President J.D. Vance. Steve Poikonen refers to him as J.D. Vance as Peter Thiel's golf glove. Notably, Ohio's richest man, Leslie Wexner, of course, I'll say, okay, along with help from the infamous Jeffrey Epstein, a Thiel associate, has spent decades creating partnerships where private interests, including those he directly controls, dominate its state and local governments. In some cases, such as the Columbus suburb of New Albany, they've completely replaced them. All right. Quietly over the last decade, Ohio has become a state of incredible national importance as it continues to attract data centers from American royalty, quote unquote, and big tech stalwarts into its friendly regulatory borders. But long before Amazon, Meta, Anduril, which, by the way, just finished a plant 3 months early, Microsoft, and others took their power hungry and literally and figuratively, how much juice they suck up, she'll probably mention that too, refuge in the Buckeye State. The most well-known financier of Jeffrey Epstein, Leslie Wexner, and his extensive crime-linked network were laying the foundation for the new Silicon Valley, now known as the Silicon Heartland, along the Ohio River. That's where they're getting the water that they need. Wexner's own statements last year underscore Ohio's coming importance in the age of ascendant AI-powered technocracy. Last May, he stated that Columbus in particular would soon become an international AI destination. He also asserted that probably the largest AI investment in the world will happen in Columbus. Wexner would know, as he's personally responsible for Ohio's, or specifically Columbus's, rise as one of the most important AI hubs in the country. Yet, Wexner, with Epstein's help, has done much more than attract massive AI data centers to the state. As this investigation is going to show, Wexner and his closest allies, Epstein among them, but much more than just Epstein, worked to create a model for the takeover of local governments via these public-private partnerships, starting first in New Albany, beginning in the late 1980s. It's since spread to cover the entire state of Ohio via a network of public-private partnerships that Wexner helped create. How convenient. This system has allowed Wexner to use billions of dollars of Ohio taxpayer money with little to no public scrutiny to finance what can only be described as a massive welfare system for corporations. Among that system's current biggest beneficiaries are, naturally, Wexner's New Albany company. So he's paying himself back for all the investment and all the time and all the connections, as well as massive big tech corporations with important ties to Epstein, like Amazon and Google. Sure. also multi-trillion-dollar corporations. Meanwhile, regular Ohioans are seeing their power bills jump, provoking an affordability crisis in the state, while funding for public schools, libraries, and healthcare is cut dramatically. Go figure. All to keep the corporate welfare engine designed by Wexner running full tilt. And the money is only funneling really one way. So here she gets into how he helped build New Albany. The New Albany Company was founded in 1986 by none other than Leslie Wexner, Ohio's wealthiest man, and his longtime associate, John, or they call him Jack, Kessler. The company was initially housed at the same address as other WEXNERLAND companies on the 37th floor of Columbus's Huntington Center. Their landlord, Gerald Hines, was a Houston-based real estate developer and chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas from 1981 to 1983. I'm sure that's going to become significant. As noted in her book, One Nation Under Blackmail, which you should have already on your shelves, Hines's real estate and other interests were enmeshed with those of the Bush family, as they're from Houston, as well as arms trafficker Adnan Khashoggi, an early client of and alleged mentor to Jeffrey Epstein during the 1980s. Yes, father of the one and only Jamal Khashoggi. According to the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the decision to create New Albany took place when Kessler and Wexner were cruising in Les's Land Rover near New Albany. The pair saw acre after acre of empty farmland, and thus the billionaire, getting a vision thing, declared to his buddy, "This will be my new home." That same report also declared that the pair, after forming the New Albany Company, quote, spun off a bunch of paper corporations to cover their footprints. Then their minions knocked on doors and made the proverbial offers that you couldn't refuse. What was once the village of New Albany is now a, again, unique public-private partnership between the New Albany Company, a private company, and the city of New Albany, the local government. Kessler told Columbus CEO in 2014, that's a magazine, that the New Albany Company has always had a very close working relationship with the city, whose leaders are very pro-development as a result. I'm guessing that the candidates that run for council in New Albany are probably people that he supports and funds. The New Albany Company, soon after its creation, developed a master plan for the town's growth and aesthetics that has been strictly adhered to since its founding. As with most public-private partnerships, the public sector in New Albany is largely subservient to its private partner, which of course is for profit, naturally. Wexner and Kessler may have wanted to exert such extensive control over this influential Columbus suburb for other reasons, too. And why would that be? Shortly before the New Albany Company was created, both Wexner and Kessler found themselves under investigation for ties to the mob-style murder of Arthur Shapiro, who was due to testify to the IRS just days after his murder. Go figure. That's a weird coincidence. Shapiro had been the lawyer for Wexner's company, The Limited, and was involved in its finances. So, one way to ensure that he would be unable to testify under oath would be to somehow arrange for or be involved with or somehow something involved with a mob-style murder, which is what is being insinuated here. He was murdered via mob-style murder. Whether Wexner was connected is alleged and unknown. In investigating Shapiro's death, there was some conjecture that Shapiro was in a position to provide information to the IRS grand jury that would have been damaging to some other party. I can't imagine who. Columbus police then determined that Wexner was enmeshed with organized crime interests, Oh boy, that's a bad thing. However, of course, the investigation into Wexner and any linkages to organized crime were halted, and the police documentation from that investigation were heavily suppressed by the Columbus chief of police at the time, James Jackson. Sure, because they're going to start to control all of it. When the documents later became accidentally public via FOIA request, Jackson was surprised and remarked that, "I thought I got rid of it," with respect to the documents in question. Oops. Sorry about that. Wouldn't getting rid of it actually constitute a crime? So, all right. Those documents will be referred to as the Shapiro murder file for the remainder of this article. Okay. So here's an article that she had written about the Arthur Shapiro homicide from beforehand. Okay. By the late 80s, Epstein, who then had crept into Wexner's inner circle, had become a general partner in New Albany's real estate holding company, New Albany Property. I wonder how that happened, and had to put at least a few $1 million into the project himself. Former state of Ohio inspector David Sturtz reportedly claimed that Epstein was Shapiro's replacement. In addition, local Ohio reporter Bob Fitrakis told New York Magazine in 2002 that Epstein had been a crucial part of the New Albany project, which I don't think is much of a surprise. But before Epstein came along in 1988, the financial preparations and groundwork for the New Albany development were a total mess. Epstein cleaned everything up, as well as serving Wexner in other capacities. Petrakis also stated that New Albany's success had required significant changes to be made to the Columbus city policy as well as zoning laws. As attested to in the Shapiro murder file, this appears to have been accomplished by questionable investments made by a Wexner-controlled entity in a jazz club run by former city council member Jeremy Hammond. I know that name, unless it's just a coincidence. Alongside his successor on the council, Les Wright. There's going to be a lot of names that we're going to talk here. It might get a little confusing, but hopefully we'll be able to pull it all back together. The file also details circumstantial evidence that Hammond was able to make payments on luxury assets and goods well above his salary, which was suggestive of bribes. Of course there would be. That's kind of how mob tactics work, if you're going to use them. As luck would have it for Les Wexner, Hammond became swept up in an emotional debate about the Wexley luxury housing project, which was a reference to the New Albany project in 1988, and was accused of selling out the city's and public's interests for Wexner's benefit, because it was true. New Albany, thanks in large part to Hammond and Wright, was able to secure its desired changes to local policy. Of course they were, because that's where money talks, and that's unfortunately in the end usually what happens. However, the accusations that New Albany's projects and ambitions were acting in defiance of existing state and local laws would continue for years. All right, and this is 8 pages of this investigation, including a diagram laying out how all these people link together. All right. And again, I'm reading the Whitney Webb and Mark Goodwin piece from Unlimited Hangout. Go read this yourself at unlimitedhangout.com. Totally free. Subscribe monthly. It's $5 a month. Support independent media. In 1990, Epstein acquired property in New Albany via a Wexner-controlled trust, with the house being widely reported as a gift from Wexner to Epstein. Epstein resigned from the trust and bought the home, which he owned from 1994 until 2007, when he and Wexner publicly cut ties after Epstein's first arrest that same year. That's when he went to prison in Florida. However, recent releases have shown the two men stayed in contact for years after. And that's what the Epstein files are showing she's talking about. Epstein subsequently sold the house in New Albany back to the Wexners that year for a reported $0. Makes sense, since he was gifted the house in the first place. That way they pay no property taxes and they just go back and forth with it. In 1992, Epstein obtained another property in New Albany, this time via a trust linked to the other partner, John Kessler. Former Epstein employee Maria Farmer filed a lawsuit alleging that she was attacked by Epstein at the property in 1996 and that Wexner's security prevented her from leaving the home for close to 12 hours. A Washington Post report confirmed that Wexner's security team monitored the home when Epstein owned it. Epstein then sold this property in 1998 to a company called HHD&B LLC, which has the same mailing address as the New Albany company, suggesting again that they were connected. How much did he sell that for, I wonder? That same year, Epstein was listed as co-president alongside Leslie Wexner of New Albany Company. So now what happened to John Kessler by 1998? Interesting. Beginning in the early 90s, Epstein was also president of the New Albany-based NA Property Inc., which early records also refer to as part of the Wexner Investment Company. Later records show that it also had used the name of the New Albany Investment Company as well as New Albany Investments. So they're using different variations of the name to create different holding companies that have completely different tax ID numbers and operate theoretically completely separate from each other, even though they're all technically linked. This is shell companies and holding companies, etc. The Wexner Foundation later referred to Epstein's role as president at NA Property as being one of his Wexner-related roles, because when they have all these shell companies, somebody's got to be an officer or a secretary or somebody as part of a board member for some nonsense. Okay? Though the Wexner Foundation claims that Epstein resigned from that role in 2007, he wasn't technically removed as the company agent until 2008, while he's going through trial and about to go to prison. Despite Wexner's previous claims that Epstein stole his money and that they had broken off all association the year prior, again, recent releases have shown that Wexner was still in communication with Epstein during that time. And they were still doing business. He wasn't just like, hey, where's my money? According to a 2002 New York Magazine profile, that's before 2007, obviously, Epstein maintained a branch of his financial advisory firm in New Albany. This article notes that, or the article she's referencing in New York Magazine notes that Epstein's presence in the Columbus suburb was incredibly strong in 2002, and that Epstein's staff for his financial advisory firm were spread between Manhattan, New Albany, and Little St. James / Big Great St. James in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The report notes that he had reincorporated this company as Financial Trust Co., based in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Financial Trust Co. and its successor, Southern Trust, were alleged by USVI authorities to have served as cover for Epstein's illicit activities. Southern Airlines. Southern Trust later became intimately involved with the use of AI in financial markets, with goals to expand into healthcare. Like maybe what a techno what do you want to call that? Transhumanism, that's the word I'm thinking of. It's unknown how long Epstein's Financial Trust Co. and its precursor maintained its New Albany branch, though it's likely related to the aforementioned NA Property / New Albany Investment Company. It's just a matter of which shell they decided to hide it under, right? Which, as noted above, which was also an entity connected directly to Wexner. So like it doesn't really matter because it all ends up flowing upwards to one person. And it's this guy through this guy. You know this guy, right? All right, and that's his wife, Abigail Wexner, by the way, in the middle. In the years that followed Epstein's supposed break from Wexner, records show that Gary Kearney, the former CEO of the New Albany Company Limited Partnership, yet another shell company, managed multiple Epstein properties, so it's very incestuous, where they all know and trust each other and are managing multiple companies and shells and wear different roles and hats and can hide there. The two men had met in New Albany via their roles at the New Albany Company. So effectively, I'm sorry, yeah. So Gary Kearney was the former CEO of New Albany Limited Partnership, managed New Albany properties, Epstein properties, including the ones in New Mexico. We talked about that one, that's Zorro Ranch, and the USVI, that would be Epstein Island, or the Little Great St. James and Little St. James. So the two men had met in New Albany via their roles at the company. Kearney started managing properties for Epstein at least as early as 1999. Roughly a decade later, in 2009, Kearney recruited Stephen Kaplinger, the former New Albany Director of Planning and Design, to help Epstein further develop Little St. James, the infamous island in the Virgin Islands. That same year, Kearney was listed as the island's construction manager and was one of 4 people, including Epstein himself, that had an affiliated credit card. So he clearly was well trusted. According to reports by 2010, Kearney was making roughly $368,000 in change per year between his salary, housing stipend, and travel costs. This would then make him Epstein's second highest paid employee at the time. Kearney wasn't the island's only long-term connection to New Albany either, as the island was insured by the New Albany-based insurance office, Central Ohio, through at least March 2019. Epstein's extensive ties to New Albany, as detailed above, lend credence to Ghislaine Maxwell's more recent statements to Todd Blanche, the current Deputy Attorney General, that Epstein ran New Albany for much of the time she was affiliated with him, despite Wexner's repeated downplaying of this role. So here we go, how we get from Silicon Valley to the Silicon Heartland. How do you get all of these Silicon Valley guys to want to build in the middle of nowhere in New Albany, Ohio? Sorry, dissent, but that's where it is. All right. In the decades after Wexner, Kessler, and Epstein first dug in, New Albany has since emerged as the premier locale in the United States for the booming data center industry. In 2014, the first notable data center moved into the Ohio River Valley, with Compass Data Centers spending $60 million to place 5 data centers on a 9.2-acre parcel of land within New Albany Business Park. The New Albany Business Park is especially relevant to Wexner, as it's also owned by his New Albany company. It's also home to Wexner-linked corporate data centers, including his Abercrombie and Fitch. Shortly after Compass Data Centers joined the neighborhood, Amazon Web Services was built 3 campuses in New Albany, followed by Meta, then they were still called Facebook at the time, and Google, now called Alphabet, each adding a campus in New Albany. So now there's like a gold rush. It's monkey see, monkey do in the tech industry, as our friend Kelly Albertine will tell you. Compass Data Centers expanded their operations into Canada and, of course, Israel in 2019. Fuck Israel. With the latter coming to fruition through a partnership with Amazon Web Services after the Azrieli Group purchased a 20% stake in the company. The Azrieli Group was founded by Israeli-Canadian tycoon David Azrieli and went on to become the largest IPO ever on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange in 2010. It has since grown into Israel's largest commercial real estate developer. I wonder how they feel about return to office policy. I'll bet I know. The Azrieli Group is a known partner of another Canadian family dynasty, the Bronfmans, who boast significant ties to both Wexner and Epstein and have been alleged to be involved in a lot of illicit operations. As it stands today, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Meta all have data centers or commitments to build data centers within New Albany, Ohio. It's almost like they're buying off their, favor with somebody or something, allegedly. In addition to the data centers, Central Ohio has also welcomed a commitment from Intel to build one of the largest semiconductor factories in the world. This decision was made in no small part due to the state offering nearly $2 billion in incentives and tax breaks for the California-based Intel, including a 30-year tax break approved by state legislators, allowing Intel to save $650 million on the backs of tax-paying Ohioans, by the way. In February of 2026, just last month, Intel announced delays until 2030 regarding this project. Of course. New Albany executives have described the Intel deal and the influx of big tech data centers as necessary to establish the Silicon Heartland in Ohio with New Albany at its center. They're also going to drain the Ohio River, would be my guess, but that's my prediction. So here is a map of all the different development and all the size of the locations. And there you've got Amgen. That's a biotech stock. And there's his Abercrombie and Fitch, Voyant, and Reiki, and Lukta, Cupertino Electric, Cyrus One. You've got a lot of organizations beyond just the ones that we mentioned. L Brands, that's another Wexner organization. HIMS, they're like they send out Viagra style pills, pharmaceuticals to cover a certain problem. So again, I'm reading Whitney Webb and Mark Goodwin's article about Central Ohio, New Albany, and the tech center that's being built there and how it happened. So you can go read this again over at unlimitedhangout.com. Incidentally, Wexner and the New Albany company played an intimate role in helping seal the Intel deal in Ohio. Again, not really incidentally. I think that's tongue-in-cheek. It was representatives of the New Albany company who approached the once quiet town of Johnstown, offering to pay up front for hundreds of acres in and around town. They paid well over market rate, and many sold their properties for over $1 million, though they had to sign non-disclosure agreements with the New Albany company to lock in those prices. I wonder how Whitney got that info. I guess it's public record. A few months after these deals were finalized, it was announced that Intel was planning to build its new semiconductor factories in that exact area. It, meaning the Intel deal, wouldn't have happened without them, said the CEO of Jobs Ohio, the state's private economic development group. All right. Look, pay attention to that organization and keep your eyes on that. Jobs Ohio, incidentally, had secured a $150 million grant that paid for the land for the Intel facilities, which formed part of an incentive package from the state of Ohio, totaling that over $2 billion. So the state gave it through this organization. I'm sure they took their cut off the top because they usually do. Jobs Ohio is a controversial dark money organization, and that's discussed in a detail later. We'll discuss that in detail later, which is good. Told you, we're already 40 minutes in. We might have to break this up into two, but we'll get there. Like other tax incentives prepared by the state to benefit Wexner-connected business deals, Ohioans are unlikely to reap any of the alleged benefits that they'll receive. Indeed, with New Albany's data center growth long promoted as essential to the economic well-being of state residents, most Ohioans have instead received only engorged electricity bills so far, despite the billions in taxpayer-funded incentives that these large tech conglomerates have received. Yeah, but that yes, and they're still going to pass that on to the consumers because they're going to drain the data center, they're going to drain the power plants. While Ohioans are turning out in record numbers to oppose building even more data centers, Ohio state legislators have responded by introducing legislations to create a new commission that would help dispel inaccurate myths about bringing more data centers into the state. Particularly, data centers planned to be built on land developed by, guess who? Leslie Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein's, and that was the state's New Albany company, because I'm sure that his estate still retains ownership in that organization. Some of those shell companies, those holding companies. In addition to Wexner's direct ties to bringing big tech giants to New Albany, there is also an important possibility that Epstein himself helped sow the seeds for their presence in the Wexner-dominated Columbus suburb as well. For instance, during the time that Epstein was intimately involved with New Albany and allegedly ran it for Wexner, he was the main and some years the only donor to the Edge Foundation. The Edge Foundation, beginning in 1999, was the host of the influential Billionaires' Dinner, in which Epstein was involved from its inception. Sounds like he created it specifically for this. From 2001 to 2017, overlapping several years with Epstein's deep involvement in New Albany, Epstein funded over $600,000 out of the total of $857,000 raised by Edge during that period. That's like 3/4 of the money. Subsequent reports have alleged that Edge's billionaire dinner was an influence operation run for Epstein's benefit, which would make a lot of sense. Notable attendees of these dinners at the time that Epstein was Edge's most influential donor include several of the founders of major big tech companies that installed themselves at New Albany during and shortly after that period of time. These founders include Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Google co-founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page. Again, all with CIA contracts. Bezos developed close ties to Epstein's fixer, Ghislaine Maxwell, while Brin and Page were both subpoenaed as part of the Virgin Islands case against J.P. Morgan regarding the bank's alleged facilitation of Epstein's sex trafficking activities. Alleged. These subpoenas were issued because Epstein allegedly led the Google co-founders to bank with J.P. Morgan, and Epstein helped advise Brin on structuring trusts for his children. Well, that's pretty interesting. I believe this might be the billionaires' dinner that's being discussed. This is an image released from the Epstein files from a 2015 dinner hosted by Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel, which Epstein attended. And I see Elon Musk there. That looks like Sundar Pichai, maybe from Google, from Microsoft. There's Zuckerberg right there. There's the robot, and Priscilla Chan, his wife. I don't know who that is off the top of my head, nor that. Anyway, in addition, Epstein attended a 2015 dinner meeting brokered by Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel, which you just saw the picture above, where Zuckerberg of Meta, Facebook, was in attendance. Thiel was considerably close to Epstein during this time and beyond, and was also an extremely influential early investor in and board member of Meta and Facebook. That was actually documented in the movie The Social Network. Thiel's Epstein ties, combined with Zuckerberg's own meeting with Epstein, could have played a role in Meta's decision to establish a presence in Wexner-dominated New Albany in 2017. So basically, if Thiel told Zuckerberg, who at that point had already become insanely wealthy, that he should build a data center in New Albany, Zuckerberg's going to listen. Last year, Meta announced that they would build yet another data center, promoted as the highest capacity data center in the world in Wexner's fiefdom. Guess who's getting paid rent on all this property? Guess who's getting a share of the property taxes because of the New Albany Corporation? I think we're going to talk about that now. So this is how he designed the Ohio corporate welfare system funded by the taxpayers. So he's funneling these grants, which are out there and legal, but the question is, how did they get on the ballot and how did they get allowed and issued in the first place? The question thus remains, why Central Ohio? New Albany was hardly a formidable city before Wexner and Epstein located their business dealings there, with a population of just over 1,500 citizens in 1990. It was small. By 2000, it had grown to just over 4,000. That's more than doubling in 10 years. That's significant growth. And since then has seen 180% growth, leaving the small but powerful suburb of Columbus sitting at a population of around 11,000 people today. New Albany, yeah, that's a pretty substantial sized town at 11,000. Reporting from Data Center Frontier in 2024 speculates as to why this region was chosen to house so many data centers. Historically, this parallel was of systemic importance to the Union Pacific Railroad system and fiber providers such as AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, and more, which all ran their broadband cables alongside the rails of the first transcontinental railroad. According to a LinkedIn post by current Oracle employee and former program manager of Microsoft's Cloud Developer Services, George Moore, this fiber optic infrastructure provides the data centers with unprecedented access to the absolute highest bandwidth in a virtuous cycle of investment. More data centers drive more traffic, which drives more fiber optic cables, which drives more data centers. It becomes this vicious cycle. And of course, the data centers are eating up power and water and resources. Not to remain a speculative theory, this flywheel of data center buildouts pushed by fiber optic growth, as described by Moore, has driven Ohio to become a leading state for data centers. According to reports from datacentermap.com, Ohio is currently home to 193 data centers, making it just the fourth-ranked state in the country, behind Virginia, Texas, and California, which are, in two cases, much larger states than Ohio, obviously, by land. Ohio now boasts more data centers than its neighboring states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Indiana, combined. Well, over half of those data centers are situated in, well over half, are situated in central Ohio, with 121 and counting just in the Columbus, New Albany area alone. They decided to have everyone build there so that they could profit from it. And that's what we're going to figure out how they did it. Unsurprisingly, the New Albany company views itself as being central to Ohio's transformation. And are they using this? Are they going to try to use this as a model to expand out into more of Ohio? For instance, the company's current CEO, Bill Ebbing, told Forbes that, quote, the establishment of the Silicon Heartland in New Albany will redefine Ohio's economic future, providing generational job opportunities while helping to reduce the country's dependence on foreign manufacturing of semiconductors, referencing the Intel planned New Albany-based plant that's now been delayed, by the way, till at least 2030, while they already are reaping massive tax benefits. As a result of New Albany's efforts, Ohio has now taken center stage as the hub of the Midwest Semiconductor Network, or the MSN. That network is notably led by Ohio State University, which of course naturally is deeply connected to one and only Les Wexner and fueled by federal investment through the Biden-era CHIPS and Science Act. Public-private partnership. God, fuck these guys. Like I said, Biden was red, Trump was blue, Trump is red, Biden. They have the same policies. They support the same people. It isn't just federal taxpayer funds that are fueling the construction of the Silicon Heartland, right where Wexner conveniently wields such power. All right. Another reason for Ohio becoming the epicenter for data centers is because of the unprecedented ways in which Ohio's private sector, led of course by Wexner-led entities, has been able to divert Ohio taxpayer funds to heavily subsidize the development of the state's Silicon Heartland. So here we go with this development company. After remaking what was once the village of New Albany into a public-private partnership under his control, Wexner turned his sights to the far larger neighboring city of Columbus, the Ohio state capital. In 2002, Wexner and Kessler teamed up with the longtime publisher on the Columbus Dispatch, John Wolfe, to create the Columbus Partnership. It's worth noting that Wolfe was very enmeshed with Wexner, serving on the board of the Wexner Center Foundation from 1990 to 2016. Wexner then chaired the Columbus Partnership for nearly 20 years and stepped down in 2021. He's now basically stepped back mostly from private life. He's also like 90. He's not that old, but he's pretty damn old. The partnership describes itself as a nonprofit organization of CEOs from Columbus's leading businesses and institutions. But in reality, it is the de facto economic development authority for the Columbus region, which includes 11 counties in and around the city. How did they get that? In fact, when the Columbus Partnership created Columbus 2020, which later became One Columbus, which is now the official economic development group of the entire Columbus region. One Columbus is also, conveniently, a public-private partnership largely funded by private corporations with significant presence in Ohio, including a lot of businesses that guess who recruited to be there? JP Morgan and Honda and AT&T and Bank of America, and of course, L Brands, the Wexner-controlled parent company of the Limited. This guy feels like Mr. Burns in every way, shape, and form. Several of its current investors are the big tech firms like Amazon, who've become deeply entrenched in Wexner's New Albany. One Columbus also developed the local government's current economic roadmap, which is aggressively focused on economic growth benefiting its corporate partnerships. Remember, profits over people all the time. One Columbus's partnership with local governments in the area has allowed them to offer the companies that they court, many of which are foreign-owned, large incentive packages that are funded by public money. Several of the businesses they court move to New Albany. These companies are attracted by these generous taxpayer-funded incentives, then purchase commercial real estate, most often from, how convenient, Wexner's New Albany company, which he then turns a healthy profit for. And then his company's going to collect fees and taxes and profit from having a sanitation service and everything else. Let's see what else he provides. The use of over-the-top incentives for corporate relocation to Columbus has been engineered by Wexner many times in the past, such as in the Wexner-backed effort to bring the CIA-linked Southern Air Transport to Columbus in the 1990s. Again, she's going to discuss that later in this article, too. Ultimately, the creation of the Columbus Partnership, or One Columbus, allowed him to both formalize and normalize arrangements like this that were once the product of backroom deals. And now they can just do it out in public. Here's a video. How long is this video? A minute and a half.
I think we have to acknowledge that the progress we've made in economic development in Central Ohio is amazing. We're probably the fastest growing mid-sized city in the Midwest. That's a significant accomplishment, and we have the opportunity to accelerate our growth. I know the answer to the success that we've had is the Columbus way, a partnership, not only between the private sector and public, but amongst all the businesses and all the public leaders in the community. We're all in this together, and we each have something to contribute. I think the opportunity for us looking forward is to recognize how much momentum and positive results we've gained in such a short period of time. Momentum is a precious thing. With momentum, we can go from, the progress we've made to really accelerated growth. So it's not outside my imagination that we could have 5% growth in the community. Other communities have, and I think our foundation puts us at that, which means we've got to be wiser and smarter and take advantage of the progress we've made, because that will lead to future progress. We have the opportunity to go from good to really great. Wouldn't it be great if we were #1 in the United States?
This all sounds great. I mean, again, what do you think he's gonna do? So she continues again. This is Whitney Webb and Mark Goodwin at unlimitedhangout.com. You can see that I put the link to the article up there on screen. Go support them and go read the article there if you don't want to listen to me read the whole thing. The Wexner-dominated Columbus Partnership has also produced another affiliate organization. Go figure, because they don't create shell companies enough. Smart Columbus, which is focused on making Columbus a test city for other smart cities in the United States. Smart meaning 15-minute. Smart meaning it's all kind of linked together and monitored by cameras. Let's see. Smart Columbus is another public-private partnership between the Columbus Partnership and the city of Columbus. God, they love their public-private partnerships, don't they? One of its goals is to end the use of privately owned conventional cars in the city, replacing it with electric public transportation. You're literally not even going to be allowed to drive downtown. That's not great. The organization was created in 2016 after the city received a $50 million Department of Transportation grant to aid that effort, along with millions more from the family foundation of Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. This goal is notably analogous to a goal promoted by the U.S. government's National Security Commission on AI, whose members included U.S. intelligence officials and representatives of big tech firms, including those which own major data centers in New Albany. Do you see how this is all starting to connect? Wexner's Columbus Partnership is also a network partner of an organization called Jobs Ohio. Jobs Ohio's other regional partners, which are 7, including the Columbus Partnership, are also public-private partnerships or private sector-led nonprofits, essentially modeled after the Columbus Partnership, but they focus on different areas of the state. As noted earlier, Jobs Ohio prepared the large incentives packages for the Intel New Albany deal, as well as the more recent Andrew. It's more organizations at the state level to funnel money to corporations for different specific vertical needs. And here she talks about Jobs Ohio. All right. And here's an Anduril deal discussed again later in a section of this article. Jobs Ohio is a very controversial organization. Created in 2011, it was the privatized replacement for the Ohio Department of Development that takes in money from what was once a public asset, Ohio's state liquor tax, which it leased the rights to through 2039 for $1.4 billion. Its lease was outrageously extended for another 14 years at no additional cost to Jobs Ohio by the Ohio Controlling Board last year. Why, when you were able to sell it for $1.4 billion for a certain block of time, would you then extend it for $0? Well, because they were greasing the skids, would be my guess. 4 years after it was created, it took in well over the $1.4 billion that it had paid for those rights. Those funds, which would have otherwise gone to fund the public sector, have ostensibly been spent on economic development, basically bribes to bring big corporations to the area. However, Jobs Ohio has been unable to produce data to back up its bold claims about job creation. It never is able to do that. While it's unknown how many jobs the group actually added, what has provably stacked up over the years are the group's known expenditures. And I'm guessing that she's got receipts for that. In addition, as a private corporation, Jobs Ohio is not required to show how the funds it takes in from the liquor tax are spent. So they take in public money because they pre-bought that money for $1.4 billion, though they've already taken in more than $1.4 billion, right? But they still continue to get that money because they bought it up front at a discount. But it also oddly pardoned delinquent loans tied to a massive state bribery scandal. So see the next section of this article about that. And has been tied to other scandals, such as that involving former Ohio State University president Ted Carter. All right. I think that was just you, Bones. I don't know if anybody else froze. Yes, no oversight. Exactly. All right. The large incentive packages of taxpayer money that Jobs Ohio is awarded to corporations ultimately come down to a large corporate welfare scheme that's directly financed by regular Ohioans and by the federal government, it sounds like. Currently, Jobs Ohio is chaired by a corporate lobbyist closely tied to current Ohio Governor Mike DeWine. Again, these guys are all in bed with each other. It's very incestuous. The problems with Jobs Ohio were succinctly summarized by the Ohio Capital Journal, which noted that shortly after Jobs Ohio was created, quote, the group Progress Ohio immediately sued, claiming that the Jobs Ohio scheme violated several provisions in the state constitution, prohibiting the state government from giving special treatment to a single corporation, including by extending credit to it. But they did that anyway. The Ohio Supreme Court threw out the suit, saying those who brought it didn't have standing to sue because they didn't show they were personally harmed by the creation of Jobs Ohio. But wait, if you created an organization that competed with Jobs Ohio called Progress Ohio, wouldn't that have impacted you? Well, my guess would be Wexner was somehow influencing that judge. But I I don't know. I'm speculating. In a dissent, then Justice Bill O'Neill was appalled, as he should have been. Quote, hundreds of millions of dollars in public funds are being funneled into a dark hole to be dispersed without public scrutiny, and the highest court in the land is looking the other way? The Supreme Court of Ohio is the last house on the street, and passing on this case is an abdication of our duty as protectors of the Constitution. Yep. But they were ordered to do that, would be my guess, by a higher authority than the state constitution, sadly. Somebody who doesn't believe in state constitutions or state governments. Today, Jobs Ohio is another node in the latest iteration of the model first developed by Wexner and Kessler in that Columbus region, in New Albany. Corporate-controlled public-private partnerships in each region are now partnered with Jobs Ohio, which then funnels what was once public money with zero transparency into the hands of corporations doing business in the state. It's a little slush fund. And let me guess whether Les Wexner and his little buddies are going to get their little cut of every time. While these incentives are often framed as essential to creating jobs, research has actually shown that in about 3/4 of the cases, the incentives packages, like those developed by Jobs Ohio, would not have influenced the company's decision to settle or expand in the state. Maybe, except that the real influence was Les Wexner and maybe Epstein at the time. Jobs Ohio was notably created by legislation signed into law by former Governor John Kasich in 2011. That year, Kasich brought on VC financier Mark Kvamme to get Jobs Ohio off the ground. Kvamme was a veteran of Sequoia Capital, I know that name, before moving to Ohio to co-found the VC firm Drive Capital. Kvamme had donated over $1 million to Kasich's gubernatorial campaign prior to him choosing him to set up Jobs Ohio. They basically bought his way into a role like that, which then gives him all kinds of power and access to set himself up for further wealth. This guy was already super wealthy, though, as a VC. Kvamme's recent activities, including those directly linked to the New Albany company, are again discussed in detail in the next section. Man, there's a lot of sections left. All right, this is a thing about the creation of the Jobs Ohio board.
It's a panel of presidents and CEOs accustomed to being paid huge salaries and bonuses, but for their service on the board of Jobs Ohio, they will receive no financial compensation. Mark Kvamme, the venture capitalist from California, picked by the governor to head up the state's job creation efforts, will run the show. Kvamme and his wife contributed heavily to Kasich's campaign and Ohio Republican groups, giving just over $100,000 since 2008. James Boland, former CEO of the Cleveland Cavaliers, gave $22,000 to the Kasich campaign. Boland and C. Martin Harris, chief information officer for the Cleveland Clinic, worked with Kasich as board members for Invacare, a healthcare company based in Elyria. Critics say it's those kinds of connections that cause concern.
I think it really sort of raises the larger question that the public has been concerned about, and that much of the legislature has been concerned about, whether or not this isn't a pay-to-play kind of situation. And there's certainly reasons to be asking those questions in light of the connections that those appointments have to the governor and his campaign.
This is a really terrific board.
The governor dismisses such talk and says the expertise on the board shows how serious an effort this is.
Each one of them come with multiple different capabilities and experiences. What the governor really wanted was a diverse board, both from an experience perspective and from a regional perspective.
Others on the board include Gary Heminger, president of Marathon Petroleum, and Stephen Davis, CEO of Bob Evans. Both companies received millions of dollars worth of tax incentives from the state this year to stay in Ohio. The lone female on the board is Pamela Springer, president of Columbus-based Manta, an online platform for small businesses. State Representative Nancy Garland says the lack of more women on the board is a glaring mistake.
It's disappointing when you know all the well-qualified women out there that can do this job.
Well qualified. Sure. Okay. In addition to these donations from Kwame, the coffers of many of Kasich's political campaigns, as well as those of the state's Republican Party, have long been filled by Wexner, go figure, who's historically been the main political donor in the state for right-leaning politicians. However, Wexner, of course, also donates to Ohio Democrats. Why buy one side when you can buy them both? Kasich also received 35 gifts from Wexner in 2010, the year before he created Jobs Ohio with Kwame, but Kasich declined to disclose the nature of those gifts. That's also how? You're a public employee getting gifts from the richest political donor in the state, and you don't have to disclose? Okay. In addition to those ties, Kasich also tapped Wexner directly in 2013 to aid the state's marketing effort to businesses based elsewhere. Again, this is where he gets to get paid as marketing to lobby and to bring other businesses into the state. According to reports, Kasich compared asking Wexner for help in this effort to a quarterback getting advice from a Super Bowl champion, Peyton Manning. Oh, God almighty. I'm going to be sick. When asked about Wexner's ties to Epstein and why it had hampered Wexner's businesses in New Albany, Kasich responded that it was because New Albany operates at the speed of business. Okay, not that they just basically buried their connection to Epstein or anything. At the speed of business. Notably, a few years later in 2016, longtime Epstein associate Gwendolyn Beck emailed Epstein about joining Kasich's campaign as an advisor for a committee on aging. This clearly suggests that Epstein at the time still had a direct line to Kasich's campaign that year. It's also important to note that while Jobs Ohio rakes in billions in what was once Ohio public funds, and while Wexner greatly influences public spending on economic development, Ohio has been forced to drastically cut funding for public schools, libraries, publicly funded healthcare programs, and much more. The money's got to come from somewhere. They can't print their own money. They don't issue their own currency. Furthermore, many of the companies enticed to the state, and the Columbus region in particular, are data centers, which again have also been raising electricity costs across the state because they're driving up the per kilowatt hour price because of their usage. They've also been linked to serious health issues and noise issues. While Jobs Ohio would argue that these data centers create jobs, the vast majority of the jobs they do create are temporary, as they are construction jobs that predictably disappear once a data center is built. You don't need much more construction once you've built the thing. Public outrage against data centers have grown in the state and around the country as a result, with the state legislature recently voting to end some of the state subsidies that help Wexner's New Albany and other areas in the state court them. As they should. These are all for-profit corporations. Why do you need them in your area draining your resources? Well, because Wexner has other businesses, ancillary businesses, that can profit from all these other businesses being here. Despite this legislation passing, Governor Mike DeWine recently used a line item veto to quietly allow these subsidies to continue. All right, so even though the state legislature passed that they don't want to continue to fund this, the governor just slipped it under the radar. And maybe that's because of his relationship with Wexner. I'm sure it can't hurt. All right. Innovate Ohio and the Ohio Fund. We've got yet another shell company. As Kasich was leaving the governor's office in January 2019, he signed off on the creation of a new government agency called Innovate Ohio. His successor, Mike DeWine, and his lieutenant governor, John Huston, both of whom have been heavily funded by Wexner, go figure, oversaw the agency's efforts to modernize the state of Ohio's public services. Let me guess, did they get any contracts with Palantir? I'm guessing so. Not unlike the pitches for Jobs Ohio and related groups, retooling of Ohio public services to be as digital focused as possible was deemed necessary in order to make the state attractive to outside business. In April 2019, Mike DeWine issued an order forcing all state agencies, boards, and commissions to adopt and use Innovate Ohio. Wow. Again, completely corrupt because Innovate Ohio was appointed by Wexner-friendly people. The initial board of Innovate Ohio included Mark Kwame, who helped create Jobs Ohio, as well as Ohio businessman turned Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno, he owned car dealerships, and venture capitalist and current VP J.D. Vance, who we know has connections to Thiel. Moreno's campaign, financed in part by, go figure, Wexner, was notably dogged by accusations that he used his position on the board at Innovate Ohio to boost a blockchain company in which he had a large stake. Other notable founding members of the board at Innovate Ohio include the head of U.S. intelligence and defense contractor Battelle, whose Columbus area facility was the alleged source of the anthrax used in the 2001 attacks. Remember that? The anthrax that was sent to Congress people and people in D.C. and NBC News, I believe, in New York. Vivek Ramaswamy, we talked about him earlier, currently now running to be the new governor of Ohio after DeWine, because these parasites never go away. They just continue to resurface. He's also joined the board of Innovate Ohio after its founding. Remember that he's got deep ties with Thiel, and he's also, I believe, a shareholder in Rumble, so he's got ties to Vance through Rumble through that as well. As part of its mandate, Innovate Ohio laid the infrastructure for and then established digital identity via the OHID system for every Ohioan hoping to access state public services. So that's like the real ID stuff. Innovate Ohio's advisory board is currently chaired by Fallon Donahue, who co-founded Narya Capital with J.D. Vance and former Mithril Capital partner Colin Greenspan. Mithril is closely linked to tech billionaire Peter Thiel. Again, that name keeps resurfacing, whose deep ties to Epstein have been further illuminated by recent releases. Vance is also a Mithril alum, and Thiel played a pivotal role in launching his political career. Narya has invested heavily in Vivek Ramaswamy's Strive Asset Management, which has also received funding from Cantor Fitzgerald, we've talked about him before, or them, whose longtime head, Howard Lutnick, or Nutlick, is currently the Commerce Secretary under Trump. He also runs Tether. Lutnick's sons are currently running Cantor in his absence, but I'm sure a phone call from daddy to sons can get whatever really he wants. But we'll see. I thought Boehner was in South Carolina. I don't think he's South Carolina. I thought Boehner was in Ohio. As previously noted, venture capitalist Mark Kwame was central not only to the creation of Jobs Ohio, but also to the early years of Innovate Ohio. Prior to moving to Ohio, while at Sequoia, Kwame was one of the earliest backers and board members of Reid Hoffman's LinkedIn, and has invested alongside Hoffman in other companies. Hoffman has since become infamous for his ties to Epstein and the Democratic Party. Remember, I believe he funded the Shadow app back in 2020. The firm that Kwame co-founded in Ohio, Drive Capital, received that $50 million grant from Ohio State University for one of its funds. Reports suggested the controversial decision to put so much of Ohio State funds into Drive Capital was related to Kwame's ties to Kasich as well as John G. At the time, G was serving as a member of Ohio State's Board of Trustees, while also serving as a director of Wexner's The Limited. No way. Yet another link to Wexner. He also had taken Wexner's spot on the board that when Wexner stepped down himself in 2012. So now you've got somebody like a loyalist, a compatriot, okay, a legacy who's going to continue along the same lines. Ohio State is also heavily funded by Wexner family donations. His name's all over the state. In addition, Kwame sat on the board of the Wexner Center for the Arts, which is chaired by none other than Les Wexner. Are we getting a pattern here? There's Reid Hoffman and Mark Kwame in front of the stock exchange the day LinkedIn went public. LinkedIn was, by the way, went up to a couple of $100 a share and then was acquired by Microsoft. So Reid Hoffman then cashed out and made a gazillion dollars. Kwame has since developed what he refers to as Ohio's own sovereign wealth fund, modeled after Singapore's state-owned investment company, Temasek. That fund, called the OHIO, how fitting, the Ohio High Growth Investment Opportunities Fund, has raised hundreds of millions of dollars from Ohio-based investors whose identities have not been disclosed by the fund. The fund does have an advisory board of several prominent Ohio businessmen, each from a major Ohio city. So she's going to talk about, notably, the businessman chosen by the fund to represent Columbus is Alex Fisher. Let me guess whether he's going to be Wexner connected. Former CEO and president of the Wexner-founded Columbus Partnership, who's currently a partner at Wexner's New Albany company. Naturally. Notably, the Ohio Fund has backed a recently approved New Albany development called the New Albany Innovation Center that's marked by Wexner's New Albany company as one of the key incentives for businesses considering moving to the Columbus suburb that he largely controls. In addition, the Ohio Fund's first big investment was the purchase of a large 148-acre property roughly 12 miles away from New Albany in Sunbury, Ohio. Are we watching the Israelization of Sunbury, where they're going to basically expand New Albany there? Or they'll just have another zip code that they can funnel other kinds of stuff through and create different laws to go back and forth and different rules? Who knows? The property is part of the Sunbury Business and Technology Park, right? Sunbury Business and Technology Park, soon to be home to a massive $2 billion Amazon data center, is being developed by, you guessed it, Wexner's New Albany company. This is really unbelievable. This guy's got his hands in every single thing. The Ohio Fund has also contributed significant sums to Narya Capital, the VC firm also co-founded by J.D. Vance. Kwame, who created the fund, has been a major fundraiser for Vance's political campaigns. Kwame, importantly, also has his own political ambitions, so watch for him to run for some kind of political office in the future. That isn't the only investment that the Ohio Fund has made with ties to the current Trump administration alone. The fund recently teamed up with Terry Coyne, who was recent chairman of the Cleveland office of Newmark, to find the next Anduril to fill a large property near Columbus's Rickenbacker Airport. Newmark's recent acquisition of this land near Rickenbacker neighbors the site chosen for military contractor Anderill's planned large drone factory. Again, later discussed in this article. Probably going to have to suspend this at some point. Andurill was created by two figures close to Peter Thiel, as well as J.D. Vance, Palmer Luckey, and Trey Stevens. The Ohio Fund is the only member of the group of investors behind Coin that Coin has chosen to disclose. I'm guessing that Wexner and other individuals are also behind him, but they don't need to disclose that. Okay, so Newmark, again, that's this guy, this company that Terry was the vice chairman for. Newmark owns the land in question and employs Coin. Newmark is a subsidiary of Cantor Fitzgerald, which also has a ton of shell and holding companies, by the way. The New York Times recently reported on how the Lutnick family and Cantor have been cashing in on AI data centers around the country, with the Columbus region apparently being no exception. Why would it be? Because they're very closely tied with Thiel and J.D. Vance and Ramaswamy. Lutnick was very close to Wexner's former money manager Epstein, who was Lutnick's longtime neighbor and also his business partner. Epstein also hosted Lutnick at his infamous island, as well as the family. All right. I'm gonna cut this article off here. This has been one of the longest reads I've done at 90 minutes. And this is part one. I'm going to come back and read part two next week. I think we're about halfway through.
Who are these people?
Last Tuesday night, I read the first half of this article titled Technate, Ohio. So for those who had not been here last week, okay, just going to read this little intro teaser of what we're talking about, and then I'm going to jump to halfway down the article, because this says that it's a 49-minute read, but last week I spent over 80 minutes reading this article, and I only got halfway. So it may take us a little while, but I do want to get through, because I read through the rest of it, and there's a lot more information I think that we need to get to, and they're laying out what their plan, Whitney and Mark lay out what they perceive to be the plan and how this all plays out in their minds in 2026, 2028, and beyond. So again, the title of the article is Technate, Ohio, How Leslie Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein Built the Silicon Heartland. All right, teasing that Ohio has become the new destination for big tech data centers and AI infrastructure. The state owes much of its rapid transformation into the so-called Silicon Heartland to the now vast array of public-private partnerships. Again, that's a very important term, public-private partnerships, pioneered by the state's richest man, Leslie Wexner, and his former money manager and fixer, Jeffrey Epstein. Again, this is at unlimitedhangout.com. I am a paid subscriber to that site, have been for years. I'm a big supporter of Whitney Webb, a fan. Mark Goodwin as well, who she co-wrote this article with. So jumping down to halfway, we start at where she talks about how these data centers started to pop up, the power behind the power. So the boom in AI data centers across the United States has also spurred a renaissance in nuclear power as data centers continue to drive the country's surging power demands. That's not a secret to anyone. Ohio is, of course, no exception. However, unique to Ohio is the fact that the state's largest corruption scandal ever is intimately linked to the state's nuclear power industry and those seeking to further expand the Silicon Heartland. How convenient. In July of 2020, 5 Ohioans were charged with racketeering in what has been described as likely the largest bribery money laundering scheme ever perpetrated against the people of the state of Ohio. This scandal led to the arrest of the then Ohio House Speaker, Larry Householder. the Ohio Republican Party chair, Matt Borges, the households advisor, Jeffrey Longstreth, and 2 Ohio-based lobbyists, Neil Clark and Juan Cespedes. The lobbyists are what we're going to talk about. The 5 men were found to be complicit in distributing bribes to members of the House in order to pass a controversial law that led to the bailout of 2 aging nuclear power plants and 2 coal power plants paid for by utility ratepayers, which is i.e. regular Ohioans paying utility bills. The 2 Ohioan nuclear power plants, Perry and Davis Bess, all right, received a $150 million a year subsidy. Hold on a sec. $150 million a year subsidy due to the passing of this law known as HB 6. Okay. 2 nuclear power plants central to this scheme were owned by Energy Harbor, which was previously known as First Energy. A lot of us know that company because it's our power company. The very company found guilty of bribing Ohio officials in order to ensure their hefty bailout. So they now have changed the name, right? Because the name First Energy is toxic and affiliated with the bailout and bribing and the corruption. Central to this bailout, let me zoom in a little bit more. Oh, God. All right. Bomb A. Okay, we passed this already. Here we go. Central to the bailout was the successful campaign by Larry Householder to take his position as Speaker of the House. He had secretly controlled a 501c4 nonprofit called Generation Now, into which First Energy had funneled around $60 million between 2017 and March 2020. That's a lot of money. According to U.S. Attorney David DeViers, who charged the 5 men, there was no mistake. This is Larry Householder's 501c4. Reporting from NPR in July of 2020 stated that DeVilliers had alleged that the money from the scheme was spent to the detriment of other political candidates and the people of Ohio. Of course, that's what 501c4s do. They trash other candidates. The prosecutors claimed that members of Householder's enterprise used those payments for their own personal benefit and to gain support for Householder's bid to become Speaker. Yeah, they likely used it. Again, I don't want to speculate how. According to the complaint filed in July 2020, during the quote-unquote spring and fall of 2018, the enterprise, Generation Now, spent millions in Company A, First Energy money, to support House candidates involved in primary and general elections, whom the enterprise believed would both vote for Householder as Speaker and ultimately would follow his lead as Speaker and vote for bailout legislation benefiting First Energy. Of course they would. The company had notably announced it was closing nuclear power plants and declaring bankruptcy shortly before in March 2018. So in exchange for these payments, Householder and his co-conspirators helped pass HB 6. All right, so they were going to get nothing. And they said the state's going to get nothing if we declare bankruptcy. So give us a bailout and at least maybe you'll get something. They also subsequently defeated a ballot initiative to strike down the law after its successful passing. That's unreal. They defeated a ballot initiative, right? The complaint confirms that Householder-backed candidates that had received money from First Energy via Householder's Generation Now organization helped elect him, who introduced the bill just 3 months into his term. Go figure. As a result of the legislation, First Energy's $60 million racketeering scheme went on to be worth $1.3 billion. So they kind of blew it up a little bit. The aforementioned Jobs Ohio, which they talked about earlier, had lent First Energy $12 million in 2015, but oddly chose to forgive the loan 2 years later. unpaid. Why did they forgive the loan? Weird. All right. As noted above, First Energy sent regular payments to householders' secret company, Generation Now, beginning in 2017. So now this is like a direct corruption bribery scandal. And people went to jail for this already. He's just reminding us all the stuff that happened with First Energy because it's going to become relevant to the Wexner stuff in building New Albany. These payments began just a few months after Householder had accompanied First Energy employees on their company jet. Nothing to see here. The payments from First Energy to Householder increased after HB 6 was introduced, including an $8 million wire to Generation Now in May of 2019. So the House Speaker has a private organization that a private company is funneling money into. He's buying ads and influence with other representatives on behalf of that company and then putting out legislation to help that company. But Generation Now, he never disclosed was his. This money was apparently used to help manufacture consent for the bailout via mailers and advertising, in addition to their own personal enrichment and benefit. Wow. The bill was passed by a 51-38 vote and promptly signed by Ohio Governor Mike DeWine. When a campaign was organized to overturn the law via ballot initiative, again, First Energy wired Generation Now an additional $38 million between July and October 2019. Yep, Denver Attaway. Politics, April 25th, 2024. Utility that bribed Ohio regulators secretly bankrolled Republican Mike DeWine's 2018 governor bid. Yep. Because they knew that he would deliver. Over the course of this 3-year period, First Energy again sent $60 million to essentially purchase the billion-dollar bailout. State prosecutors described the payments as akin to bags of cash. Unlike campaign or PAC contributions, they weren't regulated, they weren't reported, they weren't subject to public scrutiny. And the enterprise, meaning First Energy, freely spent the bribe payments to further the enterprise's political interests and to enrich themselves. I mean, again, how people aren't in jail for this, I don't know, but maybe they are. While certainly a notable story unto itself, with numerous implications for the state's booming data center industry, there are multiple connections between the parties involved to the decades-old effort by Epstein and Wexner to build out New Albany, Ohio. Again, I knew she was going to tie it back to New Albany. And this is the guy, the lobbyist, Neil Clark, a longtime lobbyist in Ohio, and one of those 5 charged with racketeering in 2020 was an essential figure within the scheme. This is the middleman. He's the connector. During conversations with Householder, which were recorded by the FBI, Clark self-described himself as Householder's proxy and also claimed that the dark money at their disposal was unlimited. Clark was also recorded saying that we call Company A, First Energy, the bank. They can fund these things for 20 years if they want to. They've got too much money and too much power. So we skip to 1999, skip back to 99. All right, this guy, Neil Clark, had formed State Street Consultants, an Ohio-based powerhouse lobbying firm with former Ohio Democratic Party Chairman Paul Tips. The firm grew into the largest government affairs consulting firm in Ohio, but not before both Tips and Clark had spent years lobbying on behalf of Wexner's Limited Brands and the Epstein-Wexner-run New Albany Company, again, that we talked about and covered in last week during the first half of this article. During this period, Wexner was working with the lobbying firm, the Success Group, which she'll get to later, in addition to Tips and Clark, to, quote, persuade the Ohio legislature in 1990 to put an amendment into an unrelated bill that in essence allowed his company to create its own government within the development. The change enabled the private government to tax new residents issue new bonds, and essentially control almost all the area. That's really important. So now New Albany is able to issue its own taxes on top of the city taxes and the county. In 1992, Wexner sought an amendment to a state law preventing his golf course, the New Albany Country Club, from reapplying for a liquor license during a 4-year wait after previously being denied said license. Well, let's see what we can do about that. Clark, alongside his future partner Tips, represented Wexner's attempt to circumnavigate this long wait, with Clark noting that he provided the services pro bono. As a charter member of Wexner's club, Clark expressed that he might like to have a cocktail after I play 18 holes of crappy golf. The same year, Clark and Wexner co-hosted a controversial fundraiser for then-President George H.W. Bush's re-election campaign, as well as Ohio House Republican campaigns. Remember how important Ohio was to Bush's re-election campaign. That Bush-Kerry race literally came down to a power outage in Ohio and a whole bunch of vote flipping. But that's alleged, but it's not really alleged anymore. It's kind of been admitted to. Karl Rove, smart tech, rerouting servers. There were definitely questions about vote flipping that night. In 2021, shortly before he was due to arrive in court, in relation to this HB6 scandal, that lobbyist Neil Clark, I don't know why, he revealed that he was working on a tell-all book of stories from his decades-long career as a lobbyist, according to reporting from Fox. Well, I can imagine what's going to happen to him if he actually does that. But Clark furthered that he wanted to set the record straight about what I did during my 40 years in the State House. And that he says things that people are going to be shocked about. He told reporters the book was nearing publication in February 2021. Guess what happened in March 2021? Clark was found dead from a bullet wound to his head in a wooded area near his Florida home. The death was quickly ruled a suicide by local authorities. Sadly, Clark was not the only person tied to this scandal who would be found dead by quote-unquote suicide. A lot of people around Clinton's, Epstein, this world end up dead. That's Neil Clark. He looks like the dad from the Wonder Years. In April of 2024, and again, Neil Clark, not a good dude. Not a good dude at all. Not saying that. You know, you lie with dogs, you catch some fleas, I guess. But okay. In April 2024, the former chair of the Public Utilities Commissions of Ohio, PUCO, Sam Randazzo, was also found dead in Columbus, Ohio. Randazzo had spent years leading the charge in Ohio to deregulate the energy grid before forming the Sustainability Funding Alliance. That was a corporation that had received payments from First Energy in 2019. The morning Randazzo was supposed to check in with the court, his body was found hanging in a building he owned. Ooh, that's a bit of a message, I'm guessing. Previously, Randazzo had pled not guilty to 22 state and 11 federal charges relating to his role in the HB6 scandal. According to reporting from NBC, Randazzo was accused of taking a $4.3 million bribe from First Energy CEO Chuck Jones, we saw his picture above, and ex-senior VP Michael Dowling in 2019 for consulting services related to writing parts of a law that would send millions of dollars in subsidies to First Energy. That's a nice subsidy. That's a consulting fee, $4.3 million. That's some high quality writing right there. Randazzo had been appointed by PUCO by Governor Mike DeWine in 2019, shortly after accepting the payment from First Energy. Seems to be in line because, as Denver had pointed out, that Mike DeWine was funded partly by First Energy. Randazzo became PUCO's chair in April 2019, the same month that HB6 was introduced. According to the Ohio Capital Journal, Randazzo had received a total of $22 million in consulting fees from First Energy, including that $4.3 million just in 2019. That same year, in November of 2019, Randazzo and PUCO issued a new order. That granted First Energy a major win, which would have been worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So, in 2021, DeWine comes to Randazzo's defense when links first surfaced between Randazzo and First Energy. Of course he does. They're all covering for each other. Randazzo was not the only personal appointment made by DeWine involving one of the major players in the scandal. Again, not a surprise. In January of 2019, at the onset of the HB6 introduction, again, what's HB6 again? All right, HB6 is allowing First Energy to get this bailout for their $150 billion. All right, I think it's million. Governor Mike DeWine appointed Dan McCarthy to serve as Director of Legislative Affairs in 2019, January. McCarthy had founded a 501c4 entity called Partners for Progress in 2017, which First Energy used to funnel money during their bribery scheme related to HB6, yet another 501c4. According to reporting from Cleveland.com, here's another one. McCarthy's Partners for Progress received $5 million from First Energy in 2017. They're just buying influence. So this is another one of these guys. $5 million from First Energy in 2017, and then another $1.2 million of that was distributed to organizations working to elect Householder as Speaker. Remember, that was what it was in the first place. It was a bribery scheme. First, they got the money to those folks. They got him elected Speaker. They then voted on the bailout, and everybody wins. Well, everybody connected to First Energy wins, as long as nobody found out. Problem is, people did find out. 1.2 million of that money, that 5 million that went from First Energy to McCarthy's Partners for Progress, ended up getting funneled down to Generation Now, which again was Householder's own organization. The group later spent millions funding ads and taking other steps to pass HB6. Mostly that's TV ads trying to propagandize and brainwash people on local TV. We need to pass HB6. It's really good for our energy. It's for our energy, to keep our energy bills down. This is what they were buying, was ads blanketing TV, begging people to vote for this. And guess what? It worked, because people do what they're told usually. Right? Another board member of Partners for Progress was Mackenzie Davis, who worked with McCarthy herself while he was president of the Success Group. Like she said, she was going to get the Success Group. McCarthy had left the Success Group to join DeWine's administration. As it relates to the power nexus in Central Ohio, the Success Group had also previously worked for Wexner's The Limited in the 1990s. This is like a marketing firm. In addition to the Ohio Electric Utility Institute, right? The Ohio Coalition for Customer Choice in Electricity, and military contractor TRW. So they're heavily involved in the energy sector, in promoting and advertising and building a name in Ohio in the energy sector. Specific. Tangentially, again, TRW also had acquired Cam Gears back in 1965. She goes way, way deep here. The latter being a firm managed by Douglas Sims Lease and founded by Lease's father. Lease then became the International VP of Customer Relations for TRW the same year of the merger. Lease then goes on to hire Epstein in the early 1980s and is believed to have played a crucial role in connecting Epstein, the Saudi arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, and his former business partner Stephen Hoffenberg. So it all comes full circle, and that's why she's talking about the tangent from TRW, is that there's also a TRW connection and link with this guy Lease, all right, to Epstein. Further and notably, the Success Group, this marketing firm, was founded and chaired by longtime Ohio Democratic figure Dennis Wojciechowski, who acted as its CEO from 1984 to 2003. Why is that relevant? He had previously lobbied on behalf of Sir James Goldsmith during a failed takeover bid of Goodyear Tire, which is Akron-based, another Ohio company. Wojciechowski had attempted to cover his business associations with the controversial Goldsmith by not registering him as his client, but instead listed a Cleveland-based law firm, which had hired him on Goldsmith's behalf, right, as the client. So they didn't want to, show the people of Ohio that this guy was involved in brokering a sale of Goodyear to a foreigner. So they sneakily hired a Cleveland law firm to mask it. This guy's associations with Goldsmith in the late 80s are certainly prudent to the Epstein-Wexner takeover of New Albany, as Epstein was apparently, again, first introduced to this elite power nexus at Goldsmith's New York mansion in the early 1970s. All right, so who's this guy Goldsmith again? All right, Paul Goldsmith, right? So he's the one that tried to buy Goodyear Tire. So Goldsmith, where are we here, was closely affiliated with Robert Maxwell. No wonder why they want to hide that. And Rothschild banking interests, as well as a member of the organized crime-linked Claremont Club in the UK. God, there's so many people that are linked to you. What we need is like a 7 C's mapping of all these people and how they link and where they're going. At some point, I might try to do that. All right. Wojciechowski found himself embroiled in a previous lobbying scandal with Wexner, which came to light in 1995. All these guys are so corrupt, just buying each other off for favor. And you know why they do it? Because they get massive return on investment every time. Every time it works. And when they don't, they go to jail, they get a slap on the wrist, they pay a fine, they do it again. Right? The Ohio lobbyist in 1995 hosted dinner parties at his home where he illegally distributed $500 checks to state legislators from 6 different subsidiaries of the Limited. So that's your $3,000 limit, I guess. Maybe there's a state limit of $500, and each one came from different organizations. So technically, that's legal, I guess. I'm guessing not. Previously, while a state representative, Wojciechowski, all right, had chaired the Citizens Commission on Nuclear Power in Ohio and was a key figure in the 70s effort to amend the method of how electricity utility companies calculate their rate base. I can imagine that that's not going to benefit the public, but yet it's going to benefit the energy companies because he's working on behalf of the lobbyists, right? These scandals and their players have direct implications on the future of Ohio's data center growth and perfectly illustrate how a small group of businessmen and lobbyists can commandeer local and state government policymaking. So this is, again, just a handful of people. They're having a ton of influence over it. So now they're getting securing questionable tax exemptions is easy in Ohio. Why is it easy in Ohio? Because of this public-private partnership stuff. So in 2013, Ohio passed a sales tax exemption that covers computer data center equipment. How convenient, in addition to materials used in constructing the centers. This tax exemption remains controversial, particularly given the increase in regional electricity prices and other issues that come with new data centers. What about the profitability in data centers and the fact that they don't need a fucking subsidy? Now, according to a January 2025 report from Policy Matters Ohio, quote, if the investments announced by Amazon, Google, and Microsoft in the past 2 years are all covered by the tax break, the state and localities could lose out on almost $1.6 billion in sales tax revenue with only modest job creation to show for it. All right. I don't even know if that 1.6 billion is correct. I'm guessing that that's overinflated. Let's call it 1.2 billion. That's still a lot of money the state's just giving away for the privilege of having these businesses house themselves there, jack up the energy bills, and drain the resources of the local community. The positive regulation for the data center industry in Ohio does not stop there, with the report further noting the state's unique property tax abatements. So here we go. Here's more benefit and favor for the data center companies. Quote, in addition to the sales tax exemption, many Ohio data centers also get local subsidies through property tax abatements. It's worth noting that Ohio does not tax tangible property like data center equipment. In Virginia, the largest site for data centers, Loudoun County, received more than $600 million in property taxes from data centers in 2023, the vast bulk of which was from taxes on equipment Ohio doesn't levy. So Ohio is providing large, invisible subsidies in the form of lesser property taxes on data center equipment than some other states. Some of the data center operators also receive other state subsidies. For example, even prior to its recent announcement that it would invest another $10 billion in Ohio data centers, Amazon was getting a job creation tax credit, so it's credited with much of the state income tax paid by its data center employees. Wait, what? It's given a rebate. Again, it's credited with the state income tax that the data center employees that work for Amazon in Ohio and pay income tax, they're kicking that back to Amazon. Why? Because the people that work for Amazon don't use the roads? Because they don't use the fire department? That insane. Because Les Wexner brokered it that way. According to 2024 reporting from Cleveland.com, these stadium-sized data centers, again, stadium-sized, from Amazon, Google, and Meta, plus less familiar names like Quality Technology Services and Cyrus One, hello CIA, hello NSA, often employ 20 to 30 or so workers when operational. That's it. With some earning tax perks for promising as few as 10 new jobs. For example, again, Amazon's 3 data centers located in Dublin, Hilliard, and New Albany received about $100 million in state subsidies, according to a 2016 report from Good Jobs First. These tax breaks, while leading to minimal employment boosts, are no small factor within Amazon's $7.8 billion plans to build more than 24 data centers in Central Ohio. If you're living in Central Ohio, get the hell out of there. I'm telling you right now. They're taking over. Final approvals for these tax exemptions are made by the Ohio Tax Credit Authority, which itself is a division of the Ohio Development Services Authority, the director of which is notably chosen by the governor of Ohio. Remember, that's Mike DeWine, that guy that was involved in all that corruption stuff back then. Public sector subsidies and tax exemptions carry a unique history in Ohio and have been routinely exploited by Wexner-controlled business interests for several decades. Take, for example, the Limited's efforts to relocate the CIA's Southern Air Transport to the Columbus area Rickenbacker Airport in 1995, which they kind of did, at least let's say in part. Wexner's The Limited Inc., then under the power of attorney of one Jeffrey Epstein, specifically sought out not one but 2 CIA-linked airlines to run its cargo during that period. I can't imagine why. As noted in, again, Whitney's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, which you should have on your shelves if you don't already. I own it. Beginning in 1992. By the way, you can also download it for free, It's on Audible. There's multiple ways to get that book. And Whitney herself has linked to a free version of this book. Okay. Beginning in 1992, the Limited began to be linked to its efforts of different airlines to relocate or set up a major presence at Rickenbacker. The first of these was the Russian state-owned airline Aeroflot. That's unusual, which created a North American subsidiary called North American Aeroflot, or NAA. Wexner's The Limited was the main force behind NAA and its activities at Rickenbacker. NAA's activities at Rickenbacker also intimately involved Arrow Air, a CIA-linked airline that had smuggled weapons as part of the Iran-Contra operation. Now remember that back in like the mid 1990s, like we were involved in Russia, in the downfall of Russia, and this is like the Yeltsin era. This is before Putin takes over. So right now you're talking about like the Robert Barron era, and when Putin's there, and we're sending guys to try to get Yeltsin elected as president of Russia, and they're totally in bed with CIA. They're operating all over Russia at that point. So it's funny that they set up a Aeroflot North America. I didn't know that. Less than a month after NAA and Arrow Air began running cargo through Rickenbacker, the main CIA-linked Iran-Contra airline, because there were multiple, Southern Air Transport, began its own efforts to become the dominant force at Rickenbacker. Southern Air first cloaked its initial attempts via the company Polar Air Cargo, which was comprised of three companies: Southern Air, Polaris Corp, and Nedmark. And yes, that Polaris Corp, like Sea-Doo Polaris Corp. At the time, SAT had the same owner it had during Iran-Contra, former CIA lawyer James Bastian. Polar Air later dissolved its relationship with SAT and sought to expand its Columbus operations. However, the Limited wanted nothing to do with this newer iteration of Polar Air and instead began courting SAT directly. So now you have the split. And meanwhile, again, they own them all. There's the Southern Air Transport plane. Boeing. They continue. Again, this is from Whitney Webb and Mark Goodwin's article from UnlimitedHangout.com. Crucial to these negotiations was a generous package of incentives from the state of Ohio that included a 75% credit against its corporate tax liability for the next 10 years. That's a $5 million low interest rate on a loan on top of it, and a $400,000 job training grant. So now you're literally giving them money to train people how to work there. The package was offered by Ohio politicians in efforts to please powerful Ohio businessmen, namely Les Wexner. SAT ultimately did relocate to Rickenbacker to run cargo for Wexner's The Limited because the incentives deal was too good to turn down. Of course it was, because the CIA made sure it was. Reporting from local Ohio journalist Bob Petrakis linked Jeffrey Epstein, who had a background in arms smuggling and was enmeshed in Wexner's finances, to the efforts to bring SAT to Columbus. I don't think it was much of a stretch. Petrakis later reported that key Iran-Contra figures like Alan Fires Jr. and Richard Secord had also been instrumental in SAT's relocation. Yeah, Wexner is, boy howdy, what a lucky guy. It's just amazing. Oh my goodness. Right? He was also told by both Ohio's Inspector General and Franklin County's then sheriff that they believed Epstein and Wexner had ties to CIA. No, you're kidding. More on what The Limited may or may not have been doing clandestinely with these airlines is discussed extensively in One Nation Under Blackmail, but is beyond the scope of this article. So go read that. Okay. Yes, exactly, Cowboy Kitty. Surely we can all vote our way out of this. And you would know because you're in Ohio. Notably, despite the lofty promises from Ohio officials and lobbyists working for the Limited, SAT, Southern Air Transport, did not create the jobs it had promised. No. It did not construct the maintenance facility it had promised to build. Nah. And it began to financially implode rather quickly, despite the $3.5 million in taxpayer funds it had received, not counting the low-interest loans. Okay, where'd the money go? Where's the money, Lebowski? Southern Air Transport then filed for bankruptcy in 1998, and its collapse was likely a controlled demolition, with $32 million of company funds allegedly appearing in the personal bank account of James Bastian's wife not long before it went bankrupt. James Bastian, again, was the owner of Southern Air Transport. He was the setup. He was the fall guy. He was one of them, but they certainly set him up. In the years since, CIA-linked airlines like Landmark Aviation, as well as Wexner-linked Lane Aviation, made their homes, guess where? At Rickenbacker. It's really like Wexner's home airport. These two airlines, after heavy lobbying from local businessmen, quote unquote, saw local law change yet again in 2011 that can clear private planes without regular customs checks at the private terminals they control at Rickenbacker. Come on, man. So wait a minute. Now these guys literally can run CIA stuff totally outside of customs checks wherever the fuck in the world they want, out of private terminals in bumfuck Columbus, sorry to those who live near there, Ohio, and run them anywhere in the world that they feel like it, unchecked, just because Les Wexner. Yeah, he's not CIA or anything, right? All right, now we get to Anduril and Erebor. These are the drone companies that have been recruited and the corruption that has been wrought in bringing these drone companies to produce directly in Ohio, and why. So now Rickenbacker is due to have a new company grace its airstrips. In January 2025, Governor DeWine announced that defense contractor Anduril planned to lease property at Rickenbacker to construct nearly $1 billion manufacturing facility dubbed Arsenal One. That's a frightening company. I don't like Anduril at all. But whether I like it or not is irrelevant, unfortunately. As illustrated in previous reporting from Unlimited Hangout, Anduril was founded by Palmer Luckey, a longtime associate of Epstein crony and Palantir co-founder Peter Thiel. Luckey met Thiel when he was only 19, shortly after Luckey founded his first company. You know, Thiel meets a lot of these young single guys, tech bros, that, anyway. Luckey is apparently married to Matt Gates' sister, I hear. Now, Luckey's first company was Oculus Rift, which was later sold to Facebook. Those are the goggles, the VR glasses, while Thiel sat on Facebook's board. So maybe he was involved in getting Luckey paid out to begin with. Shortly after he founded the Modern Warfare Equipment and Drone Manufacturing Company, Anduril was then backed by, conveniently, Thiel's Founders Fund, only then to be joined by another Palantir co-founder, Joe Lonsdale. We're going to talk about him below. Luckey's Anduril would not exist without the assistance of Thiel and several executives from Thiel's Palantir. That's a definitive statement. Absolutely true. As Unlimited Hangout has reported in numerous articles beginning in 2020, Palantir is a CIA front explicitly aimed at resurrecting the controversial surveillance dragnet once housed by the Pentagon's DARPA, known as Total Information Awareness. CIA sought to use warrantless dragnet surveillance of Americans to prevent crime and terrorism, quote-unquote, before it happens, i.e. pre-crime, a field which Palantir has since pioneered and which was essentially now made DOJ policy by Trump's Attorney General in his first term, Bill Barr. All right. We also talked about DARPA and TIA and Palantir, and at the time also LifeLog and Facebook, and how Thiel sat in the middle of all of this. That was when J.D. Vance was first announced as Trump's running mate, and people were like, who's that? And Whitney wrote this long, long article, which, by the way, I read on How Did We Miss That? It was over an hour long. And that talked about a lot about J.D. Vance and Thiel's background. Previous reporting on the founding of Anduril from Unlimited Hangout explains the intimate connections between Lucky, Thiel, and the Epstein network long before the announcement of Arsenal One coming to Central Ohio. So it's no surprise when they actually did. One of those Palantir executives who later came to Anduril, Trey Stevens, worked at a government intelligence agency. He declines to specify which one before joining Palantir. From there, Trey Stevens joined Thiel's Founders Fund and ended up on the boards of some of the most controversial Founders Fund-funded companies, such as Carbine 911. Financed in part by Epstein and the brainchild of former Israeli Prime Minister and Epstein associate Ehud Barak, Carbine's platform also involves invasive data collection from civilians and predictive policing functionalities. They're all about this pre-crime. They want to get into people's heads and predict when they're going to commit a crime and arrest them beforehand based on their behavior and patterns and social media activity. On Carbine's board, Trey Stevens originally sat alongside Ehud Barak, as well as Israeli intelligence-linked figures like Pinchas Bukris, who's former commander of Israel's Unit 8200, Lital Lashem, who's the former Israeli intelligence operative, who we now know works for documented CIA asset and former head of the infamous mercenary group Blackwater, Eric Prince. And then, of course, Nicole Junkerman. We've talked about Nicole, her in the past, and how they've censored Johnny Vedmore's reporting on Junkerman multiple times. Anytime her name comes up, basically, it gets blowed out. She's an Epstein associate who has since rebranded as a venture capitalist in emerging technologies and fintech. She's still out there. What she's doing is using copyright claims to get videos about her taken down, claiming that they're smears and lies. Stevens still remains today on Carbine's board, where he now sits alongside former U.S. Homeland Security chiefs Michael Chertoff from the Bush admin and Kirstjen Nielsen from the Trump admin. It's just a big circle jerk. Okay, so tell me how the Trump admin, again, is fighting the deep state, right? Thanks in part to Thiel's influence over the early Trump admin, Stevens was chosen to oversee Trump's transition team for the Defense Department, where he steered Trump's early Pentagon policies. I think he also steered him to hire Mike Flynn as National Security Advisor. That worked out really well. At the time, Stevens was also in talks with Palmer Luckey to create a new company. And after Luckey left Facebook, remember, Facebook bought Oculus, which means they bought Luckey, and that he went to go work for them under a cloud of controversy in late March 2017. Palmer Luckey and Trey Stevens created Anduril, and other Palantir executives were recruited to join the company. Within a year of its existence, Anduril had already netted millions in contracts from the Department of Homeland Security. Stevens has remained at Thiel's Founders Fund since co-founding Anduril. So he's got multiple roles and he wears multiple hats and is making a ton of money, by the way, in multiple roles. An underreported revelation within the recent batch of Epstein emails released by the DOJ is that Epstein likely co-invested in Anduril alongside Founders Fund via Thiel's Valor Ventures firm, specifically the Valor Global Fund 3. It appears as if Epstein invested $15 million into Valor through his Southern Trust Company in June of 2015. In an email from Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak to Epstein associate Nicole Junkerman, Barak implies that Thiel and Epstein co-owned the fund, although a spokesman for Thiel would later deny the claims of co-ownership the Byline Times, while confirming that Epstein was a limited partner. So Thiel didn't own it, but Epstein did. So maybe it wasn't a partnership, maybe it was all Epstein owned. In recent years, Anduril and Palmer Luckey himself have certainly grown in public notoriety, including an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. On that podcast, Luckey expressed the need for the United States to stop being the world police and instead become the world's gun store. No, because you're only going to arm one side. Unsurprisingly, Luckey's company would be set to benefit immensely from such an international policy pivot, especially after the completion of Arsenal 1 in the Columbus area. He's only going to be supplying one side with drones, though. He's not going to arm both sides of the conflict because we're usually on one side of the conflict. This is insane. In a story all too similar to that of booming data center expansion, the build-out of Arsenal 1 was again made possible in no small part due to massive tax breaks unanimously approved by the Tax Credit Authority of Ohio. Only a couple of weeks after the California-based defense contractor first expressed the intention to come to Ohio, Governor Mike DeWine and the Ohio Department of Development Director Lydia Mihalik had already announced the approval of significant state tax incentives, including employment tax credits for 30 years worth an estimated $452 million. Why? He had already announced that they were going there. Why are you giving them all this stuff? Those tax breaks were part of a massive incentives package prepared by the controversial group discussed earlier in this article, Jobs Ohio, along with the involvement of the Wexner-linked One Columbus. And again, remember that Wexner is making money throughout all of this on the side. The package, Jobs Ohio, that's a huge package, huge. The package that Jobs Ohio, One Columbus, and their partners prepared for Anduril is even larger than the one that they offered to Intel in New Albany, because they know that in the end, Anduril is going to be bigger for them than Intel. And because of Thiel's involvement and Epstein's ownership in Anduril, they have much more stake in wanting to bring this company into a Wexner-friendly area. All right. Luckey also has stated that Jobs Ohio's offer was an important factor in their move to Rickenbacker. I would guess that if Peter Thiel told him that he's moving Anduril to Rickenbacker, he's moving Anduril to Rickenbacker. This, by the way, is a conversation
It's incredibly
15 minutes long,
the timeline.
where he's talking about the plant that they're opening there. He's just a complete slimeball, by the way, with his mullet head, clown show, floral print shirts. And upon completion, Anduril claims that the 5 million square foot advanced manufacturing facility is geared to build drones, missiles, and other high-tech unpiloted military weapons in order to address urgent defense needs. No bueno. Luckey has stated that Ohio is central to his company's plans, stating that Ohio is going to be critical to allowing us to move fast into Arsenal 1 so that we can build the arms that the United States needs, though they don't, to deter, when necessary, large-scale conflicts. He's talking about firing on us, by the way, not quote-unquote perceived enemies. Notice he's not talking about foreigners. And his name is Luckey is just perfectly on brand. All right, so Palmer further noted that, quote, we need to build tens of thousands of autonomous fighter jets, autonomous missiles, and other combat systems that will again deter these wars. They don't deter these wars. Nobody was attacking us. They're using them to attack other countries, you fucking clown. And if they break out, win them. No, they're breaking them out. With the expansion of U.S. military action in Iran in March 2026, Lucky, and Anduril are situated to profit generously as Arsenal One is set to begin production of their first product, the autonomous fighter jet YFQ-44A, by the second quarter of this year. That's like next quarter. And yet it's Lucky's other Ohio-based company that's arguably positioned to make even more money than selling weapons during wartime, the stablecoin bank Erebor. These assholes and their goddamn Lord of the Rings fucking names. Lucky was a very early Bitcoiner, having expressed his involvement in the network as early as 2010. This is where I believe you're going to see a lot of Mark Goodwin expertise come into play. Mark has since seen the light on Bitcoin and crypto and what a grift it is. All right. But Lucky was an early Bitcoiner, having expressed his involvement in the network as early as 2010. Only 1 year after its creation, and choosing buy more Bitcoin as his quote for the 2013 Forbes 30 under 30. As noted in previous investigations from Unlimited Hangout, the 2024 Trump campaign made Bitcoin, stablecoins, and crypto in general a significant part of their platform, and the first year of a second admin was chock full of executive orders and new regulations enabling this behemoth of an industry and absolving them of all crimes, apparently. Lucky has been an outspoken supporter of Trump's, including a $100,000 donation to his first inauguration, and was allegedly let go from Facebook in 2017 due to his political views regarding Trump, which is funny because now they all kiss Trump's ass, including Zuckerberg. Lucky also credits Trump's book Art of the Deal as inspiring him to co-found Oculus, and even wrote Trump a letter in 2011 urging him to run for president. Except that Trump didn't really write Art of the Deal. Tony Schwartz, I think it was, guy. Thus, it should be of little surprise that in 2025, Lucky and a crew of ardent Trump supporters, including Palantir co-founders Peter Thiel and Joe Lonsdale, set out to actualize the second administration's stated goal of pushing dollar hegemony through stablecoins by founding Erebor Bank. Now, I think he's going to have some competition here from our Commerce Secretary, but he could be in on this too, for all we know. Much like Anduril and Palantir, the name of Lucky's latest venture is a token reference, a mountain named Erebor, which houses the dragon Smog's immense fortune of gold and jewels. Even though Ohio is arguably not at the forefront of financial technology, the founders of Erebor decided Columbus would serve as the grounds for their fortress of digital currencies. Erebor was controversially granted an OCC charter only 4 months after their application, notably the first granted from Trump-appointed controller of the currency, Jonathan Gould. Can you smell the corruption at every single level? Everyone's getting their beaks wet. Everyone's getting bought off, and nobody's stopping it. And nobody's able to stop it. Within the announcement of Erebor, which includes investments from Palantir co-founders Joe Lonsdale and Peter Thiel, no surprise, was the announcement of Jacob Hirschman as co-CEO. Who's Hirschman? He was previously an advisor to Circle, that's another stablecoin out there, including a stint as chief legal officer to the second largest USD stablecoin issuer. Okay. Erebor's launch also noted intentions to become the most regulated entity in conducting and facilitating stablecoin transactions, and to fill the void left after the collapse of SVB, which occurred in no small part due to the actions of Founders Fund. This is so incestuous. So Thiel launching Erebor is going to fix the problem that Founders Fund caused, but Erebor is founded by Founders Fund. Right, gotcha. The rise and collapse of SB, Silicon Valley Bank, was chronicled in a previous section of Unlimited Hangouts, the Chain series, including noting that Circle's USDC had kept reserves at their now failed bank. Oh, you were supposed to have matching reserves for every stablecoin Circle dollar USDC that you had issued, but that once that bank collapsed, it was basically just funny money. The bank collapse led Circle's stablecoin to depeg as low as 86 cents. Remember that these are supposed to be pegged to the dollar. They're supposed to be about 99 cents to a dollar. Howard Lutnick, the longtime CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald and the holder of the world's largest stablecoin, Tether's USDT reserves, noted in a speech at Bitcoin 2024 that Circle had a $3.3 billion of your reserves uninsured in the Silicon Valley Bank when it went bust. Tether's ties to the Epstein network was also investigated deeply within the Chain series, including founder Brock Pierce's intimate relationship with Epstein. Nothing but creepiness all around. Lutnick, who currently serves as Trump's Commerce Secretary and also brokered the deal that got Rumble its money, appeared at the CIA-funded Chainalysis conference in 2024 to express his affinity for stablecoins. Why not? It's made him insanely rich. He's got all these reserves without ever having to pay interest on all the Tether that he's got issued. Dollar hegemony is fundamental to the United States of America. It matters to us, to our economy. That's why I'm a fan of properly backed stablecoins, Tether and Circle. Oops. During his presidential campaign in 2024, Vivek the snake charmer Ramaswamy took a policy position on stablecoins, claiming that he would order the Federal Reserve to grant stablecoin issuers the same access to Fed facilities that incumbent banks enjoy, even though there's no reserve matching dollar for dollar the way they claimed initially, and then they just decided, nah, we're not really going to do that anymore. Nobody said or did shit. Ramaswamy also responded to Tether CEO Paolo Ardoino on Twitter in March of 2025, expressing his affinity for stablecoins, helping reinforce U.S. dollar global reserve status. As Ohio governor, he can be expected to be a friend to Erebor. He likely will also be a shareholder, would be my guess. This is particularly obvious when one considers that Ramaswamy's Columbus-based Strive Asset Management was seed funded by Peter Thiel and his Founders Fund. Current Vice President and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance's Narya Capital, also founded by Thiel. Howard Lutnick and Cantor Fitzgerald, also involved with Thiel heavily. And Erebor backer Joe Lonsdale, also co-founder of Palantir, partner of Palmer Luckey in Anduril. Do you see how incestuous all of this is? They all are just jerking each other off. And this is where she's predicting and starting to see, how is this all going to play out? What happened? A Vivek win in Ohio for governor will mean more of the same. Just like the a Republican win in 2026, and if they retain Congress, we're going to see more of the same versus gridlock, which we would see if the Democrats get elected and hearings announced. So here we go. Vivek Ramaswamy, whose career began in VC after graduating with an undergrad degree in biology from Harvard, is but one of many political stewards sprung from the power nexus Wexner and Epstein birthed in central Ohio decades ago. Much has been written about J.D. Vance's connections to Wexner and Thiel, as illustrated in a previous investigation by Unlimited Hangout, as well as one by Dissent in Bloom, but far less has been spoken about Vance's old friend and college buddy, Ramaswamy, who remains just as connected to the Wexner consortium as our current vice president. Ramaswamy was an early adopter of the anti-woke movement, being labeled the CEO of Anti-Woke Inc. by The New Yorker, with his anti-woke investment from Strive being bankrolled by, guess who? Thiel, Vance, Lonsdale, and Lutnick. According to BitcoinTreasuries.net, Strive Asset Management now sits just outside the top 10 largest public holders of Bitcoin in the world, with 13,311 Bitcoin. Remember that Bitcoin's worth like $100,000 a piece. So add 6 zeros onto that, and it's worth $13 billion. Strove, funny, to become the antithesis of woke Inc. investment firms such as BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and yet in the process, the firm's founder has found himself merely months away from taking the throne of one of the most important states in the nation, an appointment whose legislative decisions could influence not just the region, but literally the world itself. While many push the rhetoric that Ramaswamy's sudden removal from Doge was some sort of demotion, his push to become governor of Ohio brings with it the lever to enforce states' rights and enforce the new anti-woke Silicon Valley in Ohio's heartland. But it's best to not get distracted by the incessant framing of woke or not woke when discussing Ramaswamy's campaign, for the very stake for the domestic winners of the artificial intelligence arms race may very well fall into the Cincinnati natives' hands. Who's he even running against? I don't know. Who's the Democrat running for governor in Ohio right now? Anyone know? As Wexner and Epstein proved throughout the 20th century, local and regional governments can be bought and sold, much like the acres of land their New Albany company has leased and sold to the up-and-coming data center behemoths. This phenomenon is unfortunately quite known to Ohio, with Wexner and Epstein, in effect, building their own government within the New Albany area, not to mention the HB6 scandal that rocked the Ohio State Senate and left 2 men dead at the end of the last decade. Oops. There's Vivek and the couch fucker. Ramaswamy, whose campaigns have taken immense monetary donations from the likes of Susquehanna International Group founder Jeff Yass, Bitcoin evangelist Ross Stevens, and Epstein associate Glenn Dubin, whose wife is Eva, has spent years in the circle of the technocratic elite that grew out of Silicon Valley. He ass-kissed his way to the middle. In his speech at a Lincoln Day dinner in Ohio, according to reporting from the Chronicle, Ramaswamy expressed the intention to move the power nexus out of California and back into the heartland of Ohio. Quote, if it was Silicon Valley leading the way for the last 10 years, it should be the Ohio River Valley for the next 10 years, leading the way in manufacturing, energy, and the development of artificial intelligence, or AI, as if nobody knew what AI stood for. He's so disingenuous. As noted throughout this article, Ohio's transformation into the Silicon Heartland has come courtesy of a nexus of Wexner-created public-private partnerships and dark money networks that are bleeding Ohio taxpayers dry by siphoning public funds to make their technocratic vision for the state a reality, while raising the cost of living and gutting public services on which many Ohioans rely, including people directly watching this right now in this chat. Despite Wexner's role in financing Epstein and Epstein's own role in the rise of New Albany and the public-private partnership takeover of Ohio state economic development policy, little is being done to prosecute any of the egregious corruption documented in this article, because they don't want to end up dead, because 2 people that had testified did. Instead, thanks to a series of Wexner-funded governors, Wexner's master plan that started with New Albany has now been replicated throughout the state, conveniently. Ramaswamy, despite having once said that transparency is everything, and his claims to have saved taxpayers money at Doge, which he didn't, has made no mention of any plans to bring transparency to these dark money funnels that benefit Ohio's richest men on the taxpayer's dime. Wow, go figure. He hasn't even acknowledged that these systems exist. Why would he? While it's currently unknown how much money Ramaswamy's current gubernatorial campaign has received from this network alone, his running mate Rob McCauley has taken money from Wexner's Bath and Body Works, the New Albany Company, and the consulting firm of New Albany Company partner Alex Fisher for his past campaigns. McCauley is also the chairman of the Senate Energy and Public Utilities Committee and was the lead sponsor of Senate Bill 52, which is a piece of legislation that gives county commissioners new powers to kill wind or solar projects early in their development. Why would they want to do that? Well, because First Energy, remember, is looking to get subsidies on nuclear plants, and they don't necessarily invest in these other technologies. He notably received $13,500 from energy industry PACs during that HB6 scandal. Ramaswamy, like DeWine and Kasich before him, is on track to continue to oversee the final stages of Ohio's transformation into this Silicon Heartland, with Wexner's New Albany at its center. This is decades of planning. And yet, the overreaching implications of this story hardly remain domiciled to just New Albany, nor the central Ohio region. In fact, this influence nexus creeps far beyond the borders of the state, even outside the jurisdiction of the country. Yep. Welcome to Technate, Ohio. The localized issues downstream of a string of data centers popping up in an Ohioan municipality are numerous. Electricity prices, aquifer damage, drainage, strains on local governments and public infrastructure, air pollution and noise. When tax breaks and other incentives delivered by purchased state regulators are given to these server stewards of the internet's lymphatic system, to the manufacturers of autonomous war machines, to the stablecoin bankers for agentic entities, or to the silicon brains behind AI usurping human thought, the regional conflict of interests collide with global control structures at breakneck speed. The unfortunate example that Wexner and Epstein have made of Ohio during the last half century are but signposts of an encroaching technocratic theology that parasitically feeds on local hosts for the purposes of gestation and growth into a far larger and far more dangerous and powerful force. This is not to belittle the very real and tangible effects that citizens of Ohio must endure and push back upon, but rather that this is a trope of how the Technate governance structure utilizes balkanization and the limited resources of a local government as a means to pursue centralized outcomes of power within the hands of the technocratic elite. It reminds me very much of what private equity does. All right, they come in and chart, and they suck up all kinds of fees themselves while spending the money because they've now taken over. They're the money guys. All right, they've bought their way in, but they're now able to spend the funds however they want, and nobody's checking this. The decentralization theater that's taken rise within the talking points of the internet's most successful entrepreneurs is masking the greatest centralization of power in history. Remember how everyone wanted decentralized Bitcoin? Palmer Lucky's not talking about that now. Vivek, though he's got 13,000 Bitcoin, he's not talking about decentralized. One simply has to look at the businesses investigated in this article to see a fully realized stack of technology that can influence human behavior immensely, perhaps even at the societal level. Situated within the confines of Wexner's terrarium are banking rails for monetary weapons of mass destruction, stablecoins, literal rails for building literal weapons of mass destruction, drones, and digital think tanks capable of delivering insurmountable payloads of destruction to content creation and distribution, AI. This three-pronged fork, held by the very hand of the very power nexus that brought Epstein face-to-face with the highest levels of government figures, will leave hardly a crumb for us humans to fight over on the plate of world power. This is a coup d'etat of the global order, of the very nature of humanity, actualized by a handful of men with bottomless pockets who were willing to wait decades for their plans to come to fruition. Had these conquerors simply stormed the gates of Capitol Hill, they would have been met with the defensive force of a nation, while simultaneously revealing their now failed intentions of domination to the entire planet. The world will not be won overnight by overt kinetic force, but rather by synchronized maneuvers on numerous fronts over numerous decades, by a seemingly innocuous string of conveniences woven into a penitentiary. Okay, that would be the digital prison grid. Ramaswamy, as noted in the introduction of to this article, spoke these quiet parts out loud upon his departure of Doge. Musk and Ramaswamy were on the same page, he said, with the former taking his technologic approach and the latter focused at the state level of governance, all in an effort to divide and conquer, to save the country. You mean to control demolition of the country. While there is little evidence of their efforts saving the country, okay, there is certainly quite a lot of evidence that points toward a division and conquest, as exemplified by the corruption and consolidation within the Buckeye State. Long gone are the days of Alexander the Great and Attila the Hun, when peoples were enslaved and commodified by the victors of a violent land war. Today, the fronts of the New World War are at the intersection of mind and technology, where the Silicon conquistadors lay entrenched in their data centers, banks, and factories. While the internet is routinely compared to an ethereal cloud, in reality, its infrastructure remains tethered to the physical world, a cluster of chips and processors connected by wires to data centers, powered by generators built on land, owned, maintained, and governed by humans. Yes, humans. If this Central Ohio fiefdom is allowed to prosper without hardly an investigation or meaningful social pushback, which it likely won't, the outcome and impact on the world might be, and likely will be, disastrous. Centered and maintained in New Albany, Wexner's and Epstein's breakaway civilization could very well break apart civilization, leaving behind a scattering of pieces to be easily consolidated and conquered in its disruptive technocratic wake. And look at what's happening in Syria right now, for example, and how they've balkanized that country. Look at how they're still right now balkanizing Ukraine at the moment, right? Leslie is a girl's name, but we're not going to gender shame anyone here at the moment, Denver. There's plenty of other things to complain about Leslie Wexner's corruption that we don't have to talk about his name, though it is a sissy boy name, right? All right. Crazy. Again, that was Whitney Webb and Mark Goodwin, UnlimitedHangout.com, talking about Technate, Ohio, and the private partnerships, public-private partnerships that are siphoning public funds to recruit and give tax incentives to private industry at the expense of Ohio taxpayers. Because remember, Ohio isn't a bank. They can't issue their currency. So when they're giving tax breaks based upon income, that means that they're just going without that revenue now. They're going to have to find another way to recover it, or they're going to have to find services that are cut in order to subsidize that, which sucks. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with me through all that. I know that was long, and I appreciate everyone listening to this whole article, and I hope you learned something from it. I certainly did. Support independent media because we need it more than ever. The ways to do that are using Cash App, $ Indie News Network, at ko-fi.com/Indie News Network. That'll pop something up on screen. PayPal.me/Indie News Network. Do that as friends and family. Patreon.com/Indie News Network. You can do a monthly over at our news website, IndieNewsNow.com. It's not only the name of the show, but it's also the name of a website that you can read aggregated independent news 24/7. And you can leave a tip for the network there at the Keep the News Free section. Or you can subscribe monthly or annually over at Substack. We have two different Substacks, INNnewsletter.com for the network and IndieMediaToday.com for me and the stuff that I produce personally. Support independent media because we need it more than ever. I love you all, and I'll see you next week, fam. No! We just fucking lost the stream!
I guess this isn't such an awful place. Is that what you want?